As I became a teenager, I had a well-meaning relative confront me with the fact that I was reading a book about science, and they made it clear that I could either choose science or I could choose God. And so what's a teenage boy to do? So I walked away from faith, from God entirely, became a very strong evangelical atheist, as a friend calls me. So I would study biblical matters. I would study the Bible itself, and then I would go find Christians to go argue against. God has blessed me abundantly so that I can live a more comfortable life. And that's, none of us would agree with that in principle. We know that's not the case. God has entrusted us with much in many cases so that we could grow his kingdom much.
Trust me, I get it. You're feeling the pressure to keep your faith separate from your work, worried that pursuing your God-given dreams might be seen as selfish or misguided. For far too long, we've been held back by a world that tells us that faith and ambition don't mix, that our divinely inspired visions are just wishful thinking. But here's what I've discovered. Our faith isn't a liability in our leadership. As a matter of fact, it's the source of our strength and wisdom. When we fully integrate our leadership with our Christian values, then and only then do we tap into that unshakable divine power. The real challenge is navigating how to boldly pursue our purpose while staying anchored in our faith. And that's exactly what the Beacon Show is all about. Each week, we bring you biblical wisdom and practical strategies from true beacons, Christian leaders who are illuminating the world. And it's also that you can let your light shine brighter and brighter. I'm Tamara Jackson, and this is The Beacon Show.
Welcome to The Beacon Show, where we believe in the power of faith-driven innovation to transform lives and communities. I'm your host, Tamara Jackson, and today I am joined by Brian Holtz at Compass, and we are going to have a great conversation about why money matters. But Brian, first, I want to thank you for being willing to spend your time with our viewing and listening audience today. I know you're a busy guy, so thank you. Thank you for making time for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me be a part of it. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've already had fun just getting to know you in the few minutes before we officially hit record. And I think it would be great for our viewing and listening audience to kind of go back in time a little bit, Brian. So tell us a little bit about you growing up and then the path that God led you on.
Yeah, so a lot of interesting stories there. We could take the whole time. But so I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I don't look like it, but I did. And later moved out towards the western suburb near Joliet. Grew up in a family that was kind of nominal Christians, if such a thing exists. We went to church on Sundays. We went back the next Sunday, but we didn't do a whole lot in between. As I became a teenager, I had a well-meaning relative confront me with the fact that I was reading a book about science, and they made it clear that I could either choose science or I could choose God. And so what's a teenage boy to do? So I walked away from faith, from God entirely, became a very strong evangelical atheist, as a friend calls me. So I would study biblical matters. I would study the Bible itself, and then I would go find Christians to go argue against because they usually didn't know what they actually were supposed to believe. And so I kind of made a hobby of that. Until I was in my 20s, just finishing up college, and God kind of confronted me with some of my own points and questions and brought me back. And I reached a point where I just kind of had to say, I think I've made a mistake. I think I've missed some things. And so God slowly built me up through that. About that same time, I met my wife now, Erica. We've almost been married for 18 years now. She was on a similar journey. She's much nicer than I am, so she wasn't quite as confrontational. But we were both coming back to faith at that time, walking together. Made good money. This is kind of what led me into the pursuit of biblical finances. We were making good money just before the Great Recession, so you can see how this goes. We weren't paying a whole lot of attention, and then the pay gets cut in a matter that we simply couldn't adjust our lifestyle fast enough. We couldn't shed assets fast enough, just like everybody else. And so we went into crisis mode, and we got through some very hard times with God's guidance and his wisdom and his assistance. And coming out of that, we really tried to fix our finances using a lot of the popular secular principles, right? So pay down debt, avoid debt, spend less than you make. Those things, they're very good principles. But what we found a year later was that we were still in trouble. We hadn't really fixed the problem. And so I'm a pretty pragmatic guy. So I've worked in business. I'd worked in business for 15 years in various roles. And so I just kind of sat down with the spreadsheet and said, well, I'm going to rebalance the budget. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to get it aligned. I'm going to put a little bit more buffer in because that's what a good business person would do. And I noticed that, when I sorted the spreadsheet descending, so big numbers at the top, little numbers at the bottom, the things at the top weren't really things that I would have said were particularly important to me. And, if I wrote down the things I valued most in the world, it wasn't until you got to like line 5 or 6 before I said, well, that really matches a priority in my life. So I just kind of thought, well, I wonder what it would take to make my budget reflect my values. And then the Spirit pricked my heart and said, what would it look like if your budget reflected my values? And I said, whoa, that's interesting. So I had to go digging into scripture. I'd never heard of Compass, never heard of Larry Burkett, Howard Dayton, any of these great men, Ron Blue, never heard of any of them. And so I just went through and started studying the Word of God myself to say, what are God's priorities for money? And once I felt confident that I knew what those were, I said, well, now how do I make my budget look like that? And it was absolutely remarkable, Tamara. My marriage got better. My family relations got better. My kids got better. I enjoyed life more. And it also just so happened that my finances got better. And so what we learned through this journey was just this incredible passion for not only biblical finances, but just studying the Word of God to answer real questions in our lives. And so we've been on this journey for a while. In 2021, I officially joined the Compass Financial Ministry team as the chief operating officer. And then here in January of 24, I took the role of CEO.
Wow. Brian, as I listened to your story, I love how you spoke to, hey, I tried the things that people kind of talk about a lot. I heard as you were sharing some of the things that I heard in other popular courses that really help to get people from a practical standpoint doing the things that are necessary. But what I heard and what we talked about a little bit before we hit record is for you, this was more of a heart thing. So let's dive into this a little bit more because the viewing and listening audience definitely wants to be in a position where they're not saddled by debt and they have the capacity to be able to give and to help further the advancement of the gospel. But that can also be really difficult to do, right? When you look at all of your day-to-day financial realities. So why does the heart matter so much if you're trying to make a difference in the world?
Yeah, I think what we have to really examine is what are God's motives for entrusting to us what he's entrusted to us. And it's, the easy answer, and it doesn't sound like what any of us would ever say. It's not for our comfort, but that's really the way we approach it, is that God has blessed me abundantly so that I can live a more comfortable life. And that's none of us would agree with that in principle. We know that's not the case. God has entrusted us with much in many cases so that we could grow his kingdom much. And so it really comes down to a hard issue of what are we after? And, we talked a little bit about this concept of stewardship. And I think when we examine what stewardship really is, it's a manager. That's what their word means. It's a manager. It is meant to accomplish the goals of the owner. And so if God is the owner of all things, that means that I've been entrusted with things to fulfill his purposes, to achieve his goals. But a lot of times we get distracted by our own goals, that I want this for my life. This is what I had envisioned. This is why I started the company. And we just kind of naturally leave God's objectives and God's goals to the side, which those should be the primary purpose that we're serving, right? Is that God has entrusted these things to us. And that's a heart issue, right? My heart is turned inward rather than outward. And the purpose of God's entrusting us with the money, the possessions, the business, the job titles is all for his kingdom's growth, not for our own personal comfort.
I hope you are enjoying this episode of The Beacon Show. It is our mission here at Beaconship to empower you, the Christian visionary, to achieve the impact that you desire to create in the world. So we want to come alongside you and provide the training, the mentorship, and the funding readiness that you need to grow and scale your impact. And invite you to join our mailing list where you can receive additional insights beyond this episode to build on what you've learned here today and take you to the next level. So go ahead, subscribe today, and we'll continue to keep you motivated and inspired to move forward in all God has called you to.
Yeah. And as I hear you say that, it is completely opposite of what today's culture, especially in the United States, is focused on, right? It's how much can I earn so that I can buy X, Y, and Z or do A, B, C, right? But you're reminding us that God has a different way of looking at all of this, right? It's about entrusting resources in the hands of people that will responsibly manage it. So as you were sharing that, I was thinking about the parable of the talents. So what are we doing with what is entrusted to us? Are we burying it because we're afraid of this master that is going to be so hard on us? Or are we looking for ways to multiply it so that we can be a bigger blessing in the world? I'd love for you to talk to us about some of the things that Compass has put together that can help a person that's trying to work on their heart and get their priorities in order. How can Compass help that individual?
Yeah, so really, I mean, the truth is you could go out and do what I did. You can go study the Bible and just determine for yourself what the priorities God has laid out for money. That's a terrific exercise. It's very enriching. It'll absolutely change your life. A lot of people don't have the stomach for it. It's not their passion, the finances. And so what Compass has done is Compass has kind of done a lot of the starter work. We've organized things in a way so that you don't have to read the Bible from end to end and write down every verse that has to do with money and try to categorize it and say, this talks about giving and this talks about, stewardship. We've kind of done a lot of that work for people. And so what we try to do is we just try to set the table and allow you to come and learn, right? So we always plant our flag on 5 principles, what we call the 5 pillars of financial discipleship, which are ownership, surrender, choice, multiplication, and eternal focus. And so our goal is simply for people to engage in the content. So we don't feed you the answers. We don't give you the quick, this is what your budget ought to look like. We say, what is God's purpose for the money that he's entrusted to you? And how does your financial life demonstrate that? How does that fulfill that? And so it's really a matter of just helping you find the answers to those questions like any good coach would do. We walk alongside you and challenge you to look a little bit deeper than you might do on your own.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about surrender. That's definitely a word that God has been speaking into my life, and I believe that I'm not the only one. As I hear you walk through the 5 pillars, that one really stands out to me because in order for everything else that you've talked about on the other side of that to happen and to make a difference for the kingdom, we have to be in a place of surrender. So talk to us about what surrender means to you.
Yeah, so it really does follow that topic of ownership, that if God's the owner of all things, Psalm 24:1 tells us, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. All it contains, right? We got the cattle on 1,000 hills. We've got all the gold in the valley. Everything you can think of belongs to God. And so what is your response? Is your response to clamp down with your hands and hold on tight? Or is it to say, Lord, I now recognize this is yours, and I want to serve you well with it? That's really what surrender is. It's giving up the ownership that we never had in the first place. Emotionally, we felt like we did, but it's really just letting that go emotionally and saying, Lord, I want to fulfill your purposes. I want to see your kingdom come rather than my own. That's really what surrender is.
Brian, talk to us about what that looks like on a day-to-day basis, because I might mentally agree with that. Everything belongs to God. And maybe I even think about that when it comes to big decisions that I'm going to make in my life. But what I'm hearing from you is that surrender is a lifestyle. This is something that I do every day throughout the day. So practically, what would surrender look like if we were really to dedicate ourselves to it?
Yeah, I think the question that we talk a lot about is not what should I do with my money, but God, what would you have me do with your money? Right. And to ask that question of, and it's interesting. Wealth isn't an evil thing. Wealth is not an evil thing. There's a place for enjoying God's abundant blessing. But where we get mixed up is we make that a higher priority than what God intended. And so that daily surrender of, what purpose does this serve? Does this purchase help people grow closer to God? Does it help me grow closer to God? Does it help my kids grow closer to God? And really making those decisions, not based on what I think is best, but what does God think is best? What is aligned with God's purposes and what God has asked me to do with my business, with my position, with my family, with my car, with my lawnmower? And those things can be very small. They can be very big. I had a very difficult conversation with God when I was mowing my lawn a few years back. And I just got to thinking, what kingdom impact has my lawnmower had? It sounds stupid, but God gave me a lawnmower. What am I doing with it to grow the kingdom? And so it just so happens, as God tends to do, the next day there's a lady at church who's asking for someone to mow her lawn because the guy who normally does it can't do it anymore. And I said, all right, God, I got you. You gave me a lawnmower. I'm going to use it for the kingdom. And so it's decisions like that where, sure, that the easy answer is I worked hard to buy the lawnmower, right? And it's my lawnmower and I take care of my lawn, which is terrific. But it doesn't necessarily bring God glory. But serving people in that capacity, using those physical possessions to serve people in the name of Christ, using the money that I have to grow his kingdom. Those are all things that are actions of surrender to say, God, your priorities matter more than my priorities. All of this is yours, and I want to serve you with it well.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Beacon Show. There are others like you that need encouragement in their journey as they are pursuing what God has called them to. And one step that you can take to help ensure that they receive the support they need is to rate and review. It only takes a few seconds and it can make an eternal difference. You know how important it is to have someone in your corner that believes in you and wants to see you succeed. So take a moment to rate and review today.
I want to switch gears a little bit, Brian, because you've used in your examples a few times my business. I want to focus specifically on those of us that are blessed to own our own business, because it might be easy to say, well, with my personal finances or my personal goals, I'm going to do this. But you're challenging us to say, no, it's not just my personal life, but it's also my professional life. It's my business. How should we, or how can we as entrepreneurs glorify God through our business?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect question because God does own your business too. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. And so he's entrusted those things to us. And I think the question you're asking is the answer to the question. Mm-hmm. Every single business owner, every single professional needs to sit down and say, how does my business grow the kingdom? And it can be through evangelism. It can be through generosity. It can be through discipleship. It can be wholesale. We put a cross on our banner. It may not be. It may be a little bit more under the table. But do we have an intentional plan to use our business or our role in a business to grow the kingdom? Is it our platform, right? It may be our passion, but is it our platform to evangelize? Is it our platform to just ever so gently sneak in? Hey, I had a great Sunday service yesterday. You really ought to join me some week. It doesn't have to be on the billboard or on the banner, but it certainly should be a part of our plan to the role of my business should in some way grow the kingdom. And that should be the goal. And that answer can be lots of different things. And I think people just kind of have to see what the Spirit has put on their heart. But it really falls to, are we answering the very question that you asked?
So let's talk about financing the growth of a business. So a little bit before we hit record, we were talking about a few different scenarios, right? So there's many ways that I could do this. I could go and try to take out a loan to finance the growth of my business. I could look for donors or investors, depending upon the structure of my business, to help it grow. And as we were talking about that, you kind of shared, hey, I don't know that I'm as concerned about which path you take, but the heart in which you approach it. What are some of the things that maybe you've observed or have come up as people are wrestling with this decision on how to grow their business that maybe our viewing and listening audience needs to pay attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really fun question, and all the tactical questions. That's usually what we get. Kind of, I talk about how much fun the Q&A part is, because anybody who sits down and listens to a guy talk about money and finance and biblical finances is there for a reason. Like, they didn't just drop in because they really enjoy it. Like, they have something on their mind that they want to ask, and so that's when it comes out. And so this is a pretty common question from young entrepreneurs: how do I even get started? Right? How do I finance the growth? If it's not through debt, which is, the most common path. And so what I like to tell people is there are a couple of reasons not to. One, debt is not forbidden in Scripture. It's discouraged. We should use it cautiously, but it's not necessarily outlawed, and it's not a terrible thing. But often we go into those situations because two reasons. We're in a big hurry, and we don't want other people meddling in our business, right? We feel like we have clarity. And so I think those are the two things that are more of heart issues, right? That if I'm in a hurry, if I'm impatient, I get out ahead of myself, I take out a loan. And the tactical problem with this, obviously the spiritual problem is I'm in a hurry and I'm impatient, and patience is a fruit of the Spirit. Impatience is not. But the tactical problem is a lot of times we don't really have, as an entrepreneur, I don't have my business model figured out yet. And yet I take out a loan to buy equipment, to buy hardware, to buy software, to hire people. And I end up with the wrong equipment for what my customer wants. I end up with the wrong systems in place for what I need to produce the product. And I have the wrong people to support the endeavor, all because I just got in a hurry. And so starting slow, as impatient as we all are, myself included, starting slow has a lot of value. It really does, to be able to start with what you have and say, how can I make it work while I figure out what it is my customer really wants? What's the service look like? What do the processes look like? Who are the right people that I really need on the team before I just have a bunch of money that I can go get those things without knowing what I really want? And the second is I encourage people to look at taking on a like-minded investor. So one, lots of entrepreneurs out there love sharing their experiences, and they've kind of been down that road, and they usually have money to infuse in new businesses. But along with those like-minded investors, and it's important that they be like-minded, you don't want to introduce someone who's not a person of faith, and now all of a sudden you're unequally yoked, as Scripture tells us not to be. But when you bring in a person of faith who has experience, you bring in all of their wise counsel, and they're going to be very excited to just talk with you, to mentor you, to help you get started, because they're financially invested as well, right? There's an upside, not only from a relational perspective, but there's a big upside financially for them helping you. And so those are the two paths I recommend. Now, there's absolutely a time where, if you need to buy an MRI machine to grow your business, it's going to be tough to do that without a loan, right? I get that. It's not that you never should, but I think we're a little too quick. It's a little bit too easy of an answer for us these days to just go to the bank and get money from them.
Mm. As you were talking about that, Brian, it's also true in our personal lives, right? Because we can whip out the credit card really quickly to be able to get something that we really want today, instead of once upon a time, you actually had to save up to have the money to actually buy it. But now we have these credit lines that are available to us, and we can get ourselves in trouble on the personal side, but also, as you've highlighted, as a business, if we rack up all this debt and we haven't invested the time, not only in developing the business acumen, but also that spiritual growth that we need to be mature in how we manage our finances, we can get ourselves in a really difficult place. So I wonder, Brian, if you can, time goes by so fast. I wonder if you can share, just as we prepare to wrap up here, a final piece of advice for that change maker that's sitting here, that's watching us or listening to us, and they have a desire to truly make a difference in the world, but they don't feel like they have exactly what they need, whether it is the finances to grow and scale their mission, or maybe they'll feel like they have the team. You talked about that. What is one final piece of advice that you would give that change maker that's listening to us today?
Well, I think the easy and most profound answer is truly turn to the Lord in prayer. When we sit down and genuinely ask him, Lord, what would you have me do? He will provide answers, right? And whether it's a path to get the financing or whether it's clarity on the type of people and where to find the people, too often we, again, because we are the owner and we want to do this thing our way, we don't actually turn to the Lord until it's the last resort. In desperation, we turn to the Lord, but not as our first call. And truly going back to the beginning of, if we're surrendered to him, the first question is, Lord, what would you have me do? And I think that's the best place to start. And it's the most fruitful way to go about the question and to try to get through these struggles that we all face.
Brian, thank you so much for reminding us that everything begins and ends with him, and that it's so important to go back to the source. He's the one, as you've highlighted here, that has all the answers. He can bring the people into our life that are going to help bring this vision to life. He can bring the finances. He's not strapped for money, right? So why not go to the source of it all? Thank you again for being willing to spend your time and share all of your wisdom with our viewing and listening audience, Brian. You are a blessing, and so is the team at Compass. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a fun time.
If you've enjoyed this episode of The Beacon Show, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on another episode.